Greetings, everybody out there in the interweb. I was thinking today, actually, this is following on a couple conversations I've had recently. It's been a while since I put one of these videos up, but I've had a number of conversations about the whole abortion infanticide connection here in the months now since, of course, New York passed their abortion law, and Governor Cuomo celebrated it, and they lit up the World Trade Center pink, and everyone, I suppose, has seen video of the legislature giving a standing ovation to passing an abortion law that makes it legal for any reason up to the moment of birth. And then, of course, followed closely by the whole Virginia law, which was proposed that would have done the same thing in Virginia. And then, of course, Governor Northam's comments following that in the case of a baby where the abortion had failed and the baby was born alive, that the baby would be made comfortable as it was left to die on the table. So all of that then led to the push in Congress to pass, I forget the exact name of it, it was basically the Born Alive Baby Protection Act, something like that. Legislation which would say that in cases where an abortion fails and the baby is in fact born alive, that at that moment the normal and accepted standards of medical care for a newborn in crisis would kick in, meaning all of the medical and healthcare directives that would apply to a baby that was wanted and born in distress would take over, and the baby would be cared for. I would imagine probably put up for adoption at that point, seeing as the birth mother had already attempted to abort the child, but who knows anyway. And this all brought me back to, I believe it was 2010, maybe 2000, maybe a little after 2010. There was a big international brouhaha over a paper published in a British medical journal by two Australian philosophers, Giubilini and Minerva. Giubilini is Giubilini, and the Giubilini-Minerva paper received international attention because what Giubilini and Minerva proposed in that paper was that there ought to be a right to what they euphemistically termed after-birth abortion, which is to say infanticide. They said at the beginning of the paper, we don't like to call it infanticide. We prefer the term after-birth abortion because in our postmodern West, you can just make up words for things to try to obscure the reality of what you're actually talking about. But what they're talking about is a proposal to legalize infanticide. What was fascinating about that paper is that Giubilini and Minerva, again, two philosophers, made the case, and they actually made it very well. I recommend looking up the paper. You can still find it online and actually reading it. But they made the case, and they made it well, that there are no arguments in favor of legalized abortion, which they're both in favor of. They're both pro-choice, think abortion is necessary and should be legal, and that's a right that should be protected for women. But they made the case that there are no arguments for legalized abortion which do not apply equally to a newborn, to an infant. In other words, all the arguments you can make in support of abortion still apply, still hold for a newborn, for an infant. And of course, as you would expect, this was greeted with outrage in the medical community, and the social backlash was pretty severe. What I also found interesting was in that paper, they deferred the question of what would be the outside of this window. They're saying parents, after they have a baby, should basically be allowed to decide to terminate the baby, to euthanize the baby, if this baby was unwanted. And they said, we don't know what the outside of that envelope, that window of opportunity for parents to euthanize their newborn would be. They said that's a question we're going to defer to others to figure out, but we think that all the arguments for abortion make it clear that infanticide, or what they termed after-birth abortion, should be legal. After that paper was published, I read an article by a gentleman who writes for Slate Magazine, and because I made personal contact with him and I don't have his permission to put his name out there, I'm not going to say the name, but a gentleman who writes for Slate Magazine is published online pretty frequently, fairly well-known guy. And he wrote an article which was sort of a sounding an alarm to his fellow pro-choicers. He's also pro-choice. And he said, listen, this Giubilini-Minerva paper, fellow pro-choicers, is a huge problem for us. He said, I don't see any flaw in their reasoning, meaning I think they make an airtight case that if we support legalized abortion, if we're logically consistent, we ought to support legalized infanticide. And he said, as pro-choicers who are comfortable with legalized abortion, but who are absolutely horrified at the idea of infanticide, this is a real problem. And I think we as pro-choicers need to begin a dialogue to figure this out. So I read his article and I contacted him privately. I tracked him down on the internet and I contacted him privately. And at the time I was teaching philosophy and ethics at a community college here in Arizona. And we dealt with this question all the time. We dealt with the abortion question all the time, and had talked about infanticide a few times too. And so I contacted him. I just asked him. I said, "Has anyone contacted you in the wake of your article?" Which I thought was very good. Which I thought was a very clear-eyed, sober, and honest look at this challenge. Has anyone contacted you to offer anything like an argument that would allow you to defend and promote legalized abortion, but would allow you to resist, to draw the line at infanticide? And his response to me was no. He said, not only has no one contacted me with any kind of argument like that, he said, I don't think such an argument exists. He said, I think this is a really awful, monstrous thing that the pro-choice movement has to live with. And he said, so, and I should mention that in my email to him contacting, full disclosure, I said, I'm a Roman Catholic. I hold with the church's teaching. I'm pro-life. But I teach an ethics class, and this question comes up, and we've wrestled with this before. I've made this point to my students before, that there's a logical connection between legalized abortion and infanticide. There's no reason, no logical reason you can draw a line of demarcation at birth. And so he referred me to some of his other articles, and basically his position on abortion is, I don't want to tell a woman what to do and what she can't do because I can't be in her position as a man. I can never be pregnant. And his solution for the abortion thing is to get more contraception out there. Another discussion for another time. But here's the thing. So think of the arguments that are made in favor of legalized abortion. So one of them is the argument, just from size. Listen, it's this tiny little embryo. It's this quote unquote thimble full of tissue. And so, something that small can't possibly have full human rights, human personhood. It's a potential person, that kind of thing. But of course, that applies to the newborn as well. The newborn is also tiny. If size is a legitimate argument for human value and human rights, well, then we've got all sorts of problems, because then, of course, newborns and toddlers are less valuable than older children or adults because they're smaller, which is just patently ridiculous on the face of it. Or women are worth less, generally speaking, than men, because generally speaking, women are smaller than men. It's nonsense. It doesn't even begin to work. It's absurd on the face of it. Another argument is level of development, right? Well, listen, it's so undeveloped. The unborn, the baby in the womb, is so undeveloped. Until it's fully developed, you can't really speak of it as a human person, properly speaking. And so it doesn't have full human rights yet. It hasn't developed its full rational capacities. It hasn't developed the ability to think and to make plans and to carry on its own initiatives in life, etc. But of course, that also applies to an infant, right? An infant is nowhere near fully developed. It's the bones in the skull haven't fused, and the gastrointestinal system is still calibrating itself, as is the cardiopulmonary. I mean, it's the exact same problem for the infant. Is it also is far less developed than even its older siblings, let alone its parents. And so if that's a legitimate argument, then you can say the same thing about an infant as you can say about the unborn. Well, listen, it's such an early level of development. It's not fully developed yet. Doesn't have all its rational capacities yet, or ability to kind of run its own project in life. So therefore, it should be be allowed to be killed if the mother and father feel that that's what should happen. The environment and the level of dependency are also arguments you hear, where say, well, this isn't so. The unborn are so completely dependent on their mother, and they're in her body. I mean, that means she has rights over that unborn baby, and because the level of development means the level of dependency is so high, then the mother should be able to abort if she so chooses. That, of course, is also ridiculous, because the more dependent a person is on us, the greater our moral obligation to care for that person. And that again, that argument translates seamlessly to the infant, who is every bit as dependent as the baby in the womb. It's not like you can walk away from a newborn infant and it'll just be fine. It's no longer dependent on you because it just got born. Of course not. It's completely dependent on you. It's dependent on you for food and shelter and changing its diapers and protecting it from the elements, etc. And so, again, standard argument in favor of abortion applies equally well to the infant. And this is the case that Giubilini and Minerva were making. Well, what about the health of the mother? Well, that has always had an element of psychological and mental health. Well, what if it's just an incredible stress on the mother and the anxiety of having this unwanted pregnancy? That's true of infants too. They're no less stressful or anxiety-inducing. They can be a real emotional and psychological strain on the mother. So there again, if that's a legitimate argument for abortion, it's a legitimate argument for infanticide. The mother doesn't have the means to take care of the baby. That's no less true after the baby's born than before it was born. Again, if that's a legit argument for abortion, it's a legit argument for infanticide. So on all of these fronts, I think the question of infanticide remains in play. It remains a valid question. If we're going to support legalized abortion for any of these reasons, then you ought to support legalized infanticide. There's a guy named Peter Singer. In a deep irony, he is the chair of ethics at Princeton University. So it's a big name philosopher, a big name university, and he has advocated for legalized infanticide for a long time, unapologetically, and he's taken an awful lot of heat for it, which he accepts. But he also makes this case. He said, listen, just because a baby has been born doesn't suddenly change the fact that it's smaller, it's less developed, it's more dependent, it's utterly dependent on its parents. It can be a tremendous burden on them. They may not have the resources to care for it. And he says, especially in cases where the newborn is disabled, is defective, is deformed, he said the parents ought to have the legal right to just euthanize that infant because it won't have the same quality of life. It'll have all these issues. It's a burden on the parents. And so this is where we've ended up. And in the early days, the whole abortion debate, of course, people were up in arms when you brought up infanticide. You said, well, no one's talking about infanticide. We're talking about abortion, and this is just ridiculous. You pro-lifers are always chicken little, oh, the sky's falling, oh, this is going to lead to infanticide. But here we are. The logical conclusions are just being drawn out now. And the fact that the Congress refuses to even pass legislation protecting a baby who's born alive after an attempted abortion, I think, means that the abortion industry's cards are really on the table now. And it will be a short road to a defense of the legality of infanticide. It logically follows, and we're clearly seeing that now people are willing to defend it, even legally, even in Congress, in these special cases. And eventually, I think it'll be all cases. So this is just an exhortation to the pro-lifers to think seriously about this and to raise this objection and challenge. It's also a challenge to pro-choicers. If any of you have an argument that can demonstrate why abortion should be legal and infanticide should not, I would definitely love to hear it. I would be happy to take up that debate. But I just wanted to put that out there for people to think about and dialogue about. So as always, thanks for watching, and remember the church has what the world needs. So learn your faith, live your faith, and share your faith.